Good day. After a long wait, the European Union and the United States announced their sanctions against Russia in connection with the Navalny affair on 2nd March 2021. The European Union has been talking about sanctions in relation to Navalny for some time, and the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, committed himself to those sanctions after his disastrous trip to Moscow last month, a trip which I have discussed extensively in previous programs. The United States, or to be more precise, the Biden administration, has also talked at length about sanctions and has presented its intention to impose sanctions on Russia as in some way a sign that it is distancing itself from the supposedly accommodating policies towards Russia of the previous Trump administration. So finally, after much discussion and much waiting and much anticipation, with parts of the Western media looking forward with great excitement, we got the sanctions, or we got the announced sanctions on Tuesday, 2nd March 2021. And the immediate response I have, and I think which many people have towards these sanctions, is that they are nothing more than sanctions in name only. They are token sanctions which have no consequence and which will have no effect at all. The Financial Times has already referred to them as pusillanimous, at least in connection with the EU sanctions package, and the Washington Examiner, which is of course a Republican-oriented magazine in the United States, hostile to the Biden administration, refers to them as a pebble thrown at Angela Merkel. We'll come to the point about that in a moment. So what were these sanctions? Well, firstly, let's talk about the EU sanctions. The EU sanctions were sanctions against certain Russian officials. The Russian Procurator General, in effect the Russian equivalent of its Attorney General, the head of the Russian National Guard, which is Russia's primary internal security service, and two other Russian officials. None of these are important people. The United States announced a somewhat larger package of sanctions, including the same people, but also others, such as the head of the Russian FSB, that's the Russia's counterintelligence service, and also the head of Russia's counterintelligence force. There were also, on the part of the United States, some announcements of sanctions against certain Russian agencies, specifically certain laboratories and scientific institutions, and various companies, 14 companies in total, most of them based in Russia, but a few in Germany and one in Switzerland, which it says are in some way implicated in this affair. It's not quite clear how. None of these companies, however, is in any way a strategic company of vital importance to the Russian economy. And perhaps the most important point about these sanctions is that nearly all of the individuals who the EU and the US is now sanctioning are people who have been sanctioned already. So, to give two examples, one of the individuals who's been sanctioned is Sergei Kiriyenko, who is the first deputy chief of staff of the Russian Executive Office. That's the agency which directly works for Putin in coordination of the various branches of Russia's government. Sergei Kiriyenko was previously sanctioned by the EU and the US in October. This new sanction simply repeats the previous sanctions which were imposed upon him in October. The other sanctions which have been imposed are by the United States include an official called Bortnikov, who is the head of the FSB. Well, he has been on sanctions lists ever since the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. The European Union has sanctioned a Russian official called Bastrykhin, who is in charge of the Russian Investigative Committee, the Russian Internal Police Agency, which is the one which actually prosecuted Navalny. But Bastrykhin has also previously been on sanctions lists. So essentially, the European Union and the United States is sanctioning the same people. It's also sanctioning, by the way, the same agencies and companies. Amongst the agencies which the United States has sanctioned are the FSB itself and the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, which the West persistently refers to as the GRU. The Russians, by the way, call it the GU. Both of these have, of course, already been sanctioned. So we are now in a situation where the same companies, the same Russian officials are being sanctioned repeatedly for various offences, real and alleged, in what is becoming a sanctions merry-go-round, none of which, of course, has any effect. These are all general, really tough, hardline people. Bastrykhin, who is, as I said, the head of the investigative committee, Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, Zalotov, who is the head of Russia's National Guard, these are all tough security officials who are going to be completely unfazed by these sort of sanctions. On the contrary, they're going to see them as a badge of honour, and in fact, they already do. One individual who's been sanctioned, possibly may feel otherwise, and in his case, I have to say, the sanctions seem to me cruel and vindictive. That person is Sergei Kiriyenko, the first deputy chief of staff of the executive office, whom I spoke of before. What makes this a particularly unfair action, sanctioning him, is that, as far as I know of Mr. Kiriyenko, he is a purely civilian official, in no conceivable sense someone who seems to have been involved in security policy or in persecuting or taking any steps against Navalny whatsoever. It's a real mystery why Kiriyenko is on these sanctions lists. I think there are two possibilities. The first is that Kiriyenko, who was very much a liberal when he was active in Russian politics back in the 1990s and early 2000s, was in fact, in 1998, the last liberal prime minister of Russia. He was at that time seen as liberal and pro-Western and pro-US, and the US is known to have lobbied hard, very hard, to keep him prime minister when the then Russian president Boris Yeltsin decided to dismiss him. It's possible that the US is angry that Kiriyenko, having been a liberal prime minister and a pro-Western prime minister and somebody whom the US previously lobbied for, the US is now angry that Kiriyenko, in effect, has gone over to the other side by working for Putin, as he has done for many years. Another possibility is that Kiriyenko previously, before he joined the executive office, was the head of Rosatom, Russia's nuclear agency, nuclear power agency, which is indeed involved in producing weapon systems for the Russian military, though it is mainly known for its civilian applications. However, Kiriyenko has not been involved in that work for some time, and again, it seems strange that he should have been sanctioned over something like that. Regardless, what do these sanctions tell us? Firstly, I'm going to talk about Navalny himself. It seems to me that this is essentially the end of the Navalny affair. There's one proviso I'm going to briefly make in a moment about this, but the key point to understand about Navalny is that the Russians, until fairly recently, have been unwilling to take strong action against him because I think they have always been wary of the reaction of the West if they did. I say that because there's been lots of speculation about why Navalny has been allowed by the Russian authorities to serially break Russian laws without any action being taken against him. I think the Russians have long believed that Navalny, if not exactly a Western asset, is at least someone the West supports, and I think they've said to themselves, well, let's not jail him or take action against him because he's of only marginal importance in Russia, and taking any step against him would be more trouble than it's worth. Well, that calculus changed over the course of the autumn when, of course, Navalny became the subject of an international scandal with allegations that he'd been poisoned by the Russian authorities themselves with Novichok, and when he started accusing Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, of himself directly ordering his poisoning. So I think at that point, the Russians decided that they would take tough action against him if he did return to Russia, which he did, and that they would be prepared to face down any criticism or any action taken in respect of that in the West. And so that's why I think they've now moved to jail him. And we've seen, and I've discussed in previous videos, how the anticipated popular uprising that many expected would happen surrounding those steps by the Russian authorities to jail Navalny never in the end materialized. I think what these sanctions also show, and they confirm, is that the Russian calculation, which was made in the autumn, was that despite previous concerns that the West would make a big fuss over Navalny, in the end, its actions in support of Navalny would be so much hot air and bluster. When Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, came to Moscow, we saw that he got a tough response from Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and from the Russian media over Navalny, and basically the Russians dared him to do his worst. His worst, as we have seen, has amounted to nothing very much, sanctioning the same people, and in the EU's case, just 4 of them, and in the case of the United States, sanctioning the same people and Russian entities and companies and German entities and companies that are not vitally important to the Russian economy and which do not, in effect, change anything significant about the way Russia runs its affairs. I would add that the reaction of the international markets to these sanctions was that the ruble, in fact, strengthened as the markets realized that these sanctions did not amount to very much. In my opinion, these sanctions not only represent the end of the Navalny affair, subject to one fact, which, as I said, I will briefly discuss, but they also show that sanctions have now been maxed out. The West is not really in a position to take any further sanctions steps against Russia without these having a significant impact upon its own economy. When Washington Examiner said that the sanctions that the Biden administration announced were a pebble thrown at Angela Merkel, it was expressing its frustration that these sanctions did not include the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There's been a big head of steam in the United States to shut down Nord Stream 2 by imposing tough sanctions on German companies that involve itself in that pipeline project. Angela Merkel has strongly resisted, and it seems that the US and the Biden administration has backed off. I discussed this in another video I did recently. So the Washington Examiner and the Republicans, angry with that, speak of these sanctions as a pebble thrown at Angela Merkel, a signal by the Biden administration saying that the United States is unhappy with the fact that Germany continues to pursue its economic engagement with Russia and is going to sort of harass Germany by these sort of sanctions in respect of that, but that it's not prepared to take any real steps that would either threaten the Russian economy or materially impact on the Germans. Well, that is true up to a point, but I would say that if the situation has reached the point where the United States ever starts imposing serious sanctions upon Germany and upon German businesses and companies, then the whole relationship, the whole transatlantic relationship between the United States and Germany and between the United States and Europe is in serious danger. I would also say that, of course, there is one remaining possible avenue of Western pressure on Russia over the Navalny affair, and that is that the European Court of Human Rights has ordered Navalny's release, and the Russians have refused to comply. There's been some talk that this might result in sanctions being imposed on Russia by the Council of Europe, which is a separate agency to the EU. The Russians seem intent on calling that bluff also, and they've made very clear that if the Council of Europe does try to impose such sanctions on Russia over Navalny, Russia is prepared to quit the Council of Europe and to quit sending its cases to the European Court of Human Rights. That's something that European governments up to now have balked at doing. They want to keep Russia in the Council of Europe for a variety of reasons, and I predict that they will balk doing it again. In previous programs, I have discussed how the relationship between the EU and Russia has changed over the last few years, how Russia has gone from being the weaker party and in effect, in many cases, the supplicant, the weaker party, to become increasingly the stronger one, with the EU no longer able to dictate to Russia as it once did. It seems to me that the Navalny affair simply underlines that fact. I'm afraid it also shows the same thing about the relationship between Russia and the United States. The Biden administration has huffed and puffed and talked a great deal about sanctions and about how it would pursue a different policy towards Russia than the Trump administration. But the sanctions that it has up to now announced really do not amount to very much. And the major concession that has been made between the US and Russia since Joe Biden became president was made by the Biden administration to Russia when Joe Biden agreed that the United States would extend the New START Strategic Arms Treaty by 5 years on Russian terms. So, sanctions are maxed out and are proving increasingly ineffectual. The Russians will shrug their shoulders, will move on, and in the meantime, the US and the EU have been shown have had their bluff over sanctions once again called. What have the EU and the US actually, in practical terms, achieved as a result of the Navalny affair? Well, they've annoyed the Russians very much. They've created a situation where the Russians are now reacting strongly to any criticism and are firing criticisms back. Borrell himself, the EU's High Representative, has admitted to his own dismay when the Russians brought up the situation in Catalonia during his visit to Russia and during his meetings with Lavrov. Any future Western leader who comes to Russia and tries to lecture the Russians on human rights issues is going to face the same reception. At the same time, we've seen that the Russians have called the US and the EU bluff, and that the sanctions that the West imposes on Russia when the Russians take the kind of actions that they have done over the Navalny affair really don't amount to anything much. So, what the West has done is annoy Russia, expose its weakness, and give the Russians more confidence going forward that in future they can take these sort of steps and nothing very much will happen. I return to Washington Examiner's comment about how the sanctions package the Biden administration has announced was throwing a pebble at Angela Merkel. I think that's a misconception. I think these sanctions were actually negotiated between the EU and the US, and I think there was agreement between Merkel and Biden, or at least between Merkel and the Biden administration over these sanctions. I don't think Merkel feels any sort of pebble thrown in her direction at all. Rather, what this episode, in my opinion, shows is that if you want to hunt the bear with a pea shooter, you will not hurt the bear. You will merely make the bear angry. Thank you very much for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs. In the meantime, please check me out both on this channel and on our various other channels. Our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and also please look up Alex's channel and the channel which we now do, where we show you our interactions with our various viewers during our live streams. You'll find links under this video. You'll also find links to our various other platforms, to our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Odyssey, Rumble, and the rest. And you will also find links to other places you can support us, such as Patreon, Subscribestar, PayPal, and the rest. Lastly, don't forget to look up our shop. See the wonderful things you will find there. Our famous magic mugs, our amazing t-shirts and sweatshirts and hats and hoodies. and I look forward to you joining me on my next program. Thank you very much.